All right. So for those of you here who don't know me, I'm Sarah Krotz, the current director of the Canadian Literature Centre, Centre de Littérature Canadienne. And the CLC is housed at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory in the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 4. It is, as I said, so wonderful to see so many people here. Welcome and bienvenue à tous. A special welcome today to Dr. Steve Patton, the Dean of Arts at the University of Alberta. And many of you are joining from much farther afield, which is one of the benefits that these online events afford. So merci de nous joindre aujourd'hui. It is such a pleasure to begin this new academic term with the launch of two exciting and timely books on Canadian literature. Cautiously Hopeful, Metafeminist Practices in Canada by Marie Carrière, and All the Feels, Tous les Sons, Affect and Writing in Canada, Affect et Écriture au Canada, co-edited by Marie Carrière, Kit Dobson, and Ursula Matisse-Moser. Needless to say, this has been a challenging year for all of us, and including in university teaching and research, and an especially challenging time to be in university administration. In the midst of these challenges that we've been facing, it is so important to remember and celebrate what animates us as scholars, teachers, readers, and writers. To remember why this is all worthwhile. So the reading and thinking and critical conversations that these two books represent are indeed something to celebrate. I would like to thank a few people, particularly Jason Purcell and Matthew Stepanek, the founders of Glass Bookshop, for co-organizing this event with the CLC. Both books can be purchased from this wonderful independent Edmonton bookshop, which is a great supporter of Canadian writing, with special attention paid to LGBTQ, to SIA and IBPOC writers. I would also especially like to thank my small but mighty team at the CLC, Austin Lee, and particularly Matthew Cormier for the work and care that they put into this, this event. Thank you also to Oliver Rossier, who is assisting us today. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the distinguished scholars and writers who will be introducing and reading from these two monumental books. Marie Carrière is a professor of English at the University of Alberta, where she has also served as the director of the CLC for 12 years and is now Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts. Marie is the author of several books on feminism and contemporary writing, and the co-editor of many more, including with Jason Purcell and Curtis Gillespie, the award-winning critical anthology, 10 Canadian Writers in Context. Today, of course, we are here to launch Marie's latest monograph, Cautiously Hopeful. Look at it. Isn't this an absolutely beautiful book? Metafeminist Writing in Canada, which came out in 2020. So evidence that some good things did happen last year. Marie also co-edited the other book that we are launching today, All the Feels, Tous les Sons, with two valued colleagues and longtime affiliates of the CLC, Kit Dobson and Ursula Matisse-Moser, who are joining us today from Calgary and Innsbruck, Austria. And Marie has the first copy of the book, and it is also stunning. Kit Dobson is a professor in the Department of English, Languages and Cultures at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Treaty 7 territory, and the author of Mauled, Deciphering Shopping in Canada, and Transnational Canada's Anglo-Canadian Literature and Globalization. He has also edited and co-edited a number of books, among them with Smaro Cambarelli, one of the contributors to All the Feels, who may be here now, is coming in today, I think, if she's here. Welcome, Smaro. A book of interviews titled Producing Canadian Literature, Authors Speak on the Literary Marketplace. Ursula Matisse-Moser est professeure émérite au département de langue et littérature romane de l'Université d'Innsbruck et directrice du Centre d'études canadiennes. Elle a aussi fondé et dirigé les archives textes et musique et la plateforme de recherche Culture en Contact. Récipiendaire de plusieurs prix prestigieux, elle a reçu le prix international du gouverneur général en études canadiennes. Auteur du livre d'Annie Laferrière, La dérive américaine, elle a aussi dirigé, entre autres, Écrire au-delà de la fin des temps, les littératures au Canada et au Québec, Writing Beyond the End of Times, The Literatures of Canada and Quebec, with Marie Carrière. Merci de nous joindre, Ursula. Now, as part of this launch, we will also hear readings from two renowned Québécois writers who contributed to this volume as well. Louise Dupré, membre de l'Académie des Lettres du Québec, de la Société royale du Canada et de l'Ordre du Canada avec une vingtaine de titres à son nom, et Nicole Brossard, qui a publié une quarantaine de livres et dont sa poésie a influencé toute une génération de poètes et de féministes. Leurs écrits sont célébrés par de nombreux prix et distinctions majeures. So we have an exciting roster of readings ahead. So you will be hearing first from Marie about her monograph, and then from her co-editors and our special guest readers from All the Feels. These readings should take just about all of our scheduled time, but after the readings, you are most welcome to stick around. Linger for a while if you can and engage as warmly as Zoom will allow in some conversation. Thank you, everyone. And Marie, I pass it over to you.
Okay, well, merci beaucoup, Sarah. And thank you for taking on the CLC directorship in such challenging times. And so thank you for everything that you do, and to the CLC, including Matt and Austin, for organizing this event. And so welcome to all of you, friends, colleagues, collaborators, and the contributors to All the Feels. I think some of you are here today. And I also want to say a special welcome to my professor, Linda Hutchin, who joins us today as well. Thank you to Glass Bookshop for co-hosting this event, and a special shout out to my friend Jason Purcell for co-hosting this event, and also for his instrumental time at the CLC over the years. These were years of very hard work, a lot of friendship, and a lot of laughter. And so thank you for everything, Jason. And I'd like to say a special hello as well to my family. My mom, Marie, is here, my partner, Jeff, and my girls, Caroline and Sophie, who are about to play a starring role in this little reading today. So I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement as well from my position here on Treaty 6 in Amiskwasi Waskahikan in Edmonton. And some of you here may have already heard me in my other functions read from a treaty recognition written by Lewis Cardinal, who is Woodland Cree from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation. In this acknowledgement, Lewis Cardinal emphasizes relationships, forging them and strengthening them. But I actually found a treaty acknowledgement in the text of Cautiously Hopeful, and I was happy to find it there, as one is when going back to writing from some time ago. And I found it in the section that opens onto the ethics of care, which is a theme that I take up in this book. And so I would like to start there in a section titled Ubiquitous Care. Care also reminds humans both of our humanity and of our connection to the non-human, nature, animals, technology, that surrounds, defines, and sustains embodied beings in our material environments. Care extends to a way of being when one is learning the importance, as my colleague Christine Stewart writes, of being in good relations with extended kinship systems on a local and global level, a principle she devises from the elders and the knowledge keepers of Treaty 6 and their understanding of the interconnectedness and balance among human and non-human entities. Stewart and I are both settlers, occupying Treaty 6 in Métis Nation Region 4 territory, which stretches from Western Alberta through Saskatchewan and into Manitoba, and includes 50 First Nations and other First Peoples, such as the Papas Chase. While the very notion of care implies relationality and connection, as with any ethical model, there's nothing given or certain about its outcome. And so that short passage leads me to introduce two major goals in this book. And one of those goals is to bring together seemingly disparate writing by Canadian, Indigenous, and Quebecois women authors in French and in English under the banner of metafeminism, which is a term that was coined by Laurie Saint-Martin in 1992. A second goal of the book is to examine or re-examine major streams of feminist thought in relation to the ideas suggested by the prefix meta, to delineate their continuity and difference with their own intellectual histories, and so feminism's internal tensions. These streams include intersectionality, Indigenous feminisms, affect theory or affect studies, care ethics, and the possibility of feminist alliances. And this is really how I understand metafeminism as, at least for me, a useful critical term and reading practice to trace and recognize the turns and the returns that characterize feminism today, whether as a form of theory or literary practice. In particular, metafeminism, I suggest in this book, holds very firmly within its grasp by both encompassing and extending and often surpassing the work of so-called second wave feminist pioneers and their work to counter interrelated systems of gender, racial, colonial, and sexual oppression. But perhaps I should start at the beginning, and I will read a bit from the book's opening. Reflections and deflections. When I began to think about metafeminism as a possible paradigm to consider contemporary forms of feminist literary practice, notions of growth and revitalization were not at the forefront of my mind. Instead, I saw the ambivalences, paradoxes, and conflicts within feminism, which the multidirectional nature of the prefix meta seemed to denote. For some time, feminism represented for me an uncomfortable space of both the culminations and the insufficiencies of the feminisms of decades past. This is so, I think, for a lot of Western women, especially other Generation X women, who came to feminism through mostly academia and faced almost from the beginning ambivalence between pessimism and optimism, indifference and engagement, and other seemingly irresolvable tensions around political and theoretical effectiveness and agency. Yet recent years have been ripe with feminist reawakenings. Among them, the hashtag #MeToo movement sheds light on the pervasiveness of sexual assault and harassment. Black Lives Matter fights racial and colonial violence, and Idle No More calls for Indigenous sovereignty and environmental protection. And so I believe that ours is a time of important renewal where feminism is concerned. I believe that ours is also a very non-feminist and indeed anti-feminist time. And so in the spirit of that opening paragraph, I'd like to offer a sort of meta commentary about the commitments in this book. And in the interest of time, I'll restrict myself to 3 of these commitments, and I will try not to put anyone to sleep as I do so. So I will go quickly. So one commitment is to address the multiplicity, the internal dissonances, the differences of feminist thought and writing practices. And so to think about what critic Misha Kafka called at the start of this millennium, the innumerable ways of doing feminism. So to think about a feminism that may have moved well beyond the mother term, already fractured at its origin, but without sounding the death knell of feminism. This, to me, is a tremendously important observation. When I asked my then 16-year-old daughter, C, what feminism meant to her, her reply was immediate and enlightening. I'm all about feminism, but I won't spend my entire life thinking about it. Seeing my worried expression, she added, feminism is good, though. Kafka and C drive home the need for a term like metafeminism to denote perhaps the only fundamental truth about feminism, that it has no single beginning, no single definition, no single end, and thus no single history. But metafeminism is also a forceful reminder that the internal differences defining feminist thought today need not be considered only in negative, neoconservative, fraught, and ultimately anti-feminist terms. And so another commitment in this book is to redress the presentism of contemporary feminist theory by insisting that streams of thought we may take for granted as part of our feminist discourse actually have a history that is worth recalling, if not revisiting. And again, 2 very quick examples in which I take on presentist tendencies would be intersectionality, which we hear more and more about in the mainstream, as well as affect theory or affect studies, and by extension, the new materialism, as well as post-humanism. The introduction to All the Feels, the book that we'll talk about in a few moments, also gestures toward some of the erasures of feminist thought that inadvertently exist in ideas such as an affective turn having renewed humanities scholarship, as if feminist theory and writing, as if Black and women of color feminisms, as if Indigenous philosophy haven't been studying for a very long time how bodies feel and think and matter politically and in relation. One other commitment in this book is perhaps unsurprisingly to theory, and I will end on this. Writing and analyzing from a theoretical standpoint has had me thinking about how I write or want to write in this book, a reflection that transforms into a commitment to the essay form, and more particularly the French essay, which I sought to adopt for this book, and in which I decided to do away with chapters, initially not to my editor's delight, but they came around. Which brings me to the envoi that closes the book, which is a sort of meta section or afterword in postface that tries to work through the complexities of feminist scholarship, as well as theories, readability and unreadability. Envoi, un essai. There are some passages in Cautiously Hopeful that bring in my own excess baggage as a researcher trained in comparative literature and post-structuralist theory, as a white settler scholar, and as a cis heterosexual woman in her various relationships of daily and ordinary care. Taking up intermittently, at least, what Smaro Cambarelli calls, in All the Fields, scholarship without reserve, has meant slowing down my writing process. Hopefully, I've decelerated enough in my writing to create some moments, to borrow from author Louise Warren, of textual flânerie, to be available, attentive, and curious, and as a result have maintained that availability, attentiveness, and curiosity. Perhaps in typical meta-feminist fashion, I sort of do and sort of do not realize what I set out to accomplish. Maybe I too enact the gesture of both encompassing and moving beyond where traditional academic writing is concerned, and remembering what Bill Hooks says about feminism, that feminism is for everybody. Simply put, how might I say I in my academic writing? So simply put, that when I told my then 13-year-old daughter S about this idea, she replied, "It's not hard, Mama." And you can hear the tonal emphasis. We learned that in first grade. Fair enough. What I had not yet explained to my darling, but have started to now that she's a bit older and progressively wiser, is that figuring out the use of the first person as a woman within the academy is in fact not simple at all. But there is also a rich lineage of the feminist essay in this country. And so in this envoi, I hold on and I stay with the idea to trace that history further. Hence my argument that my essay is an attempt, my attempt, at what may be a metafeminist form of academic writing, considering its tensivity with the very genre it incorporates. This essay is an attempt to figure out how my ongoing scholarly learning can breathe life or let life breathe into forms of expression beyond standard academic writing. There is much to be learned from wanting something both ways, writes Maggie Nelson in The Argonauts. Recall C, my daughter C, at the beginning of this book, who wanted feminism both ways. I dig it, but I'm not necessarily going to talk about it. Writing about feminism today requires a form that is more supple and more metafeminist than what the standard academic monograph allows. It requires a flexible form that is less exhaustive and less exhaustible, that does away with parts and chapters, that is fugitive, a little vulnerable, writing that wants it both ways, much like cautious hopefulness itself. Alors maintenant, je vais faire la transition au texte dans tous les sens, All the Fields. Et d'abord, remercier mes deux collègues, Ursula Mathis-Moser et Kit Dobson, qui ont assuré avec moi, bien sûr, la co-direction de ce volume. Je tiens aussi à remercier les collaborateurs et collaboratrices qui ont réfléchi avec tant de soin aux questions de ce volume dans leur langue et selon leurs approches et styles respectifs. And a warm thank you to the University of Alberta Press. I think members of the team are here today. And thank you for their incredible copy editors for providing a home for this demanding bilingual collection. And so I received my copies of All the Fields about an hour and a half ago, and they still fresh, they still smell fresh off the press. And so before I pass on the microphone to Kit, I just want to recall that the seeds of this publication, All the Fields, were planted at a conference called, thanks to Ursula, Les Maladies de l'âme, Maladies of the Soul, Emotion, Affect. It, like another conference 2 years before on crisis in literature, was co-organized by the Canadian Studies Centre at the University of Innsbruck and the CLC. A total of 4 publications have ensued from this extraordinary collaboration between our 2 universities and our 2 centers. And so I extend a special thank you, et vraiment toutes mes amitiés, to Ursula Moser, who allowed so much of this to happen. And so, Kit, over to you.
All right, thank you. Merci beaucoup, Marie. Et merci à Ursula aussi. It's lovely to see everybody here. And, you know, we were talking a little bit before the event started, and we said that in many ways, it's most terrifying to speak to a room of people where you know everybody in the room, or many of the people in the room. I don't know everyone in the room, but I know many of you, and it's really wonderful to see you here. By my estimation, we're being joined by people who are coast to coast across Canada. We also, just from looking, we have participants who have chapters, one among the 15 chapters of the book, All the Feels. And we have people joining us from places like, Ursula, of course, joining us from Austria, but I see folks from Spain, Norway, and elsewhere. And it's, as much as I'm deeply ambivalent about everything that this strange time has brought to us, I'm also keen to make the most of it where we can. And so being able to see you all from all these far-flung locations is really warming to me. And also similar to Marie, I can't go without a shout out to also my former PhD supervisor, also Linda Hutchin. It's really lovely to see you, Linda. It's lovely to see everyone here. So my task today is to introduce this volume to you all, and to hand it on to 3 more speakers about the book, All the Feels, Tous les Sens. We have Ursula, who's going to speak about her chapter, and we have Louise Dupré and Nicole Brassard, who are also going to share briefly from their contributions to the book. And so what I want to do, I'm just going to speak very briefly, picking up on what Maria said about the conference that was the origin point for this volume. And I want to read just a couple short pieces from the introduction to give you folks a sense of what is at stake with this work. Now, I haven't quite received my copies yet down here in Treaty 7 territory. I'm glad to come to you from Treaty 7 territory, also the Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta's territory. And I look forward to receiving them really soon. It's really exciting. You know, the unboxing moment that Marie has had is one I look forward to very much as soon as it happens. And it really is also worth just saying how much I appreciate the labors of everybody at the University of Alberta Press. To say that it's been an exceptionally difficult time over the last year is, of course, an extreme understatement by now. And the work that the press has done to complete the labor on this really very demanding book has been Herculean and is really deeply appreciated. The work involved in putting together a bilingual book is, I'm sure many people in the room can appreciate, really very challenging and really quite unique. So it's really a deep pleasure for me to be involved in it. So I'm going to share with you briefly from the introduction. Affect, we might say, is everywhere. And as far as practically all forms of academic research are concerned, affect has been around for a long time. Our starting point in this volume is an understanding of affect as an assemblage of thought and emotion, and inevitably as a theory of emotions as well. Particularly since the 1970s era of high theory in humanities research, a number of critics from disciplines ranging from economics to psychoanalysis to contemporary feminist philosophy have bridged the otherwise long-standing metaphysical division between thought and emotion, and by extension, between mind and body. They have understood, as do we and the contributors to this collection, that emotion is both internal and external, both private and public, that it is intertwined rather than in conflict with the mind, the body, our actions, and our beliefs. That affects such as happiness, shame, optimism, and melancholia emanate both from within ourselves and from the social structures that organize us. And that affectivity is a source and an effect of our individual and collective thought processes and actions. The literature, for its part, has always been a student of emotions. Critics responding to the affective turn in the humanities are now catching up to, or at least remembering that fact. They're remembering, too, that human and non-human life, to quote Lombardo and Mulligan, is a collection of affects, desires, beliefs, decisions, and actions that are infinitely more varied than what Freudian and psychoanalysis was able to anticipate. In other words, the tenor, aims, and focuses of criticism change when we bring affective reading practices to literary analysis, something we've already seen in critical work that predates the contemporary focus of this collection. For instance, in the scholarship pertaining to 1970s feminist writings in English Canada and Quebec, as well as Quebec's lyrical intimate poetry of the 1980s, the complexities of feeling and corporeality, and the relation between personhood and the collective bolster reflections about writing, representation, and agency. That is to say, and I'm stepping away now from the introduction, that what this book endeavors to do is to take concerns of affect and emotion and build on the critical tradition that already predates it. Marie has already indicated it in Quebecois writing, in Indigenous theory, Indigenous writing, in writing from across Canada and internationally. What this volume endeavors to do is to build on those questions of affect and emotion that are paving the way forward for reconsiderations of what our contemporary moment might mean, what our contemporary moment might look like. Now, this book, though, of course, it emerges during what's been an exceptional time. Right? 2020 brought a series of highly unanticipated events and outcomes, and these are events that have also necessarily shaped this book. So just as Marie left you with the part of the envoi from Cautiously Hopeful, I'm going to send you folks on to hearing from Ursula with the envoi that we wrote for the introduction of this book, that we wrote as we were in the midst of revising it, and that I think can also give a sense of the vitality of completing this work at this time. So, as we approach the publication of this volume in the spring of 2020, and now imagine everything that happened between then and now. Oof. The world is at a near standstill as the coronavirus pandemic spreads across the globe. It is a time of deep uncertainty. We do not know what comes next. We hope for the best possible outcomes while we fear for the worst. Questions of emotion and affect have become more pertinent than ever. In our correspondence with friends, family, and colleagues, feelings of exhaustion, fear, and anxiety are spreading alongside hopeful moments and gestures. For the privileged and fortunate among us, care seems widespread and is being touted as an antidote to fear. Meanwhile, the recent murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, seen on video by millions, has set the world alight. As we also recall the police-related deaths of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, Ahmaud Arbery outside Brunswick, Georgia, Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto, Ontario, and so many, too many others. Founded in 2013 by 3 Black women organizers in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, the Black Lives Matter movement is now ever present. We are seeing collective action on the part of Black and Indigenous people and people of color, as well as acts of white allyship in the mass anti-racism protests taking place everywhere. Calls for the end of state-sanctioned violence and white supremacy, and the recognition that the COVID-19 crisis is also a racial, social, and economic emergency, with minority groups disproportionately suffering and dying from the disease. If we invoke care as a possibly productive countermeasure, it can only be in the form of an ethics that is intersectional, recognizing the interrelated factors of race, gender, and class in social oppression and injustice, and one that centers on the vulnerable, the excluded, the murdered, and the missing. Although this volume is one offering among many, we hope that it contributes not only to discourses about Canadian, Indigenous, and Quebecois literatures, but also to our future conversations about how to build the best world possible in a time of change. We insist that theorizing and enacting a politics of care will be a key part of formulating the world to come. And these essays point the way. With that in mind, I would like to please pass the conversation over to Ursula, who's going to share with you from her contribution to this book.
Okay, success. Well, hello, or rather good evening from my side too. I'm one of the 3 editors, but more than that, I'm here as a friend of my 2 colleagues, as a friend of the writers we are going to see tonight, and as a friend of many of the contributors to our volume. Canada, to work with Canadians, to be in your inner circle means a lot to me. It's really a very precious part of my life. I'm also the director of the Canadian Studies Centre of the University of Innsbruck, and the CSC has a long-standing transatlantic relationship with the University of Alberta, with the Canadian Literature Centre, and above all, with its founding director, Marie Carrière. And I hope that this very special relationship will continue to flourish with our new director, Sarah Kratz. As already mentioned, this volume is the result of a 5-year research cooperation with 2 conferences, one in Innsbruck in 2015, one in Banff in 2016. The first explored, as Marie said, crisis and beyond. The second focused on malady of the soul, emotion, affect. The proceedings of the Innsbruck conference were published in Europe in 2017, republished in Canada in 2019. The Banff proceedings are being celebrated right now. Si l'on regarde de plus près les titres des 2 conférences, on voit tout de suite qu'ils sont reliés entre eux. Car d'une part, nous vivons en état de crise avec des événements marquants comme le 11 septembre 2001, la pandémie de 2020. D'autre part, et c'est précisément cet état de crise qui provoque et justifie l'exploration de l'affect et des nouvelles maladies de l'âme. Si il y a des ugly feelings, colère, dégoût, souffrance, blessure, impuissance face aux bottes du néocapitalisme, toutes même face à la notion de développement durable. Mais il y a aussi une nouvelle approche de l'altérité, la découverte du relationnel, de l'éthique du soin, de la résilience. C'est ici que je vois le potentiel de ce livre, car il s'intitule All the Feels, tous les sens. Il offre une panoplie de réflexions dans les 2 sens, si bien que j'aurais souhaité pouvoir emprunter à Marie son titre merveilleusement parlant et senti de Cautiously Hopeful. On m'a demandé de présenter ici un exemple concret de l'étude des implications affectives de la communication littéraire et j'ai choisi ma propre contribution intitulée « Grand-mère et petite-fille, des doublons désaccordés. Réflexion sur une éthique du care dans Mère Grand de Tassia Trifiatis ». Dans ce 2e roman de la jeune auteure québécoise, publié en 2011, l'écrivaine aborde une relation affective très spéciale que j'évoque au début de mon article. De Marie-Claire Blais à Tassia Trifiatis, en passant par Dany Laferrière, Marie-Célia Yang, Ying Chen et d'autres, des figures de grand-mère habitent notre imaginaire. Figure qui renvoie presque toujours à cet autre qu'on appelle petit-fils ou petite-fille, avec qui elles interagissent et évoluent. Dans ces récits, la dialectique entre plénitude et sagesse de l'âge et tâtonnement indécis de l'enfant, avec éventuellement un inversement de rôle au bout du chemin, s'avère rarement suffisante pour couvrir toutes les facettes de relations intergénérationnelles dont Trifiatis a ainsi caractérisé la complexité. Sur la ligne des temps qui nous ont regardés, parfois c'est moi qui étais petite, d'autres fois c'était elle, des doublons désaccordé. Il s'agit donc de l'histoire de deux femmes qui représentent deux générations. Cette histoire se déploie en 45 chapitres, renvoyant chacun aux rencontres dominicales des protagonistes pendant un an. Elle est racontée à la première personne par Josepha, qui assiste à la démence progressive de sa grand-mère. Mais l'intérêt du roman dépasse de loin l'histoire d'une aïeule et la photographie d'une démence. Le roman présente les interactions complexes entre une grand-mère et sa petite-fille depuis l'enfance de cette dernière jusqu'au dernier moment de la grand-mère. Les chapitres mêlent sans ordre chronologique observations, réflexions, souvenirs, évoquant ainsi un processus sans cesse mouvant, avec comme moment de structurant de courts enchaînements associatifs qui rappellent la démence. Le fait que l'intensité émotionnelle du processus prime sur la reproduction d'une histoire linéaire est mise en évidence par des insertions en italique où le moi fait appel à un tu, la grand-mère, le lecteur, et condense ainsi l'impact émotionnel du fragment en question. Dans l'introduction, j'aborde aussi, bien que brièvement, une question élémentaire lorsqu'on parle d'émotion en littérature, car les implications affectives des processus de communication littéraire touchent au moins 3 domaines: l'auteur, le texte et le lecteur. En ce qui concerne l'habitus affectif de l'auteur, des entrevues, des autobiographies, mais surtout aussi des poétiques personnelles ou des renvois à l'usage que fait l'auteur, par exemple, des anciennes catégories aristotéliques de la compassion, de la peur, peuvent renseigner là-dessus. En ce qui concerne la réponse émotionnelle du lecteur, il faudrait des recherches empiriques, telles que les études de la réception allemande les ont réclamées. Reste le texte comme véhicule d'affect ou d'émotion, et c'est là l'approche qui domine la plupart des essais rassemblés dans notre volume, tout comme mon propre travail. Ma méthode consiste donc à allier l'analyse classique du roman, le travail sur le texte, à une réflexion sur l'éthique du care. Dans ce but, j'esquisse d'abord les fondements de l'éthique du care selon Gilligan, dont ressort un vivre avec au lieu d'un vivre contre autrui, ainsi que l'idée de la complémentarité comme permettant accéder à la maturité. Cette idée de base se prête à merveille à l'analyse du roman, où il est question non seulement du passage de la plénitude de la vie à l'antichambre de la mort, mais aussi de celui, justement, de l'adolescence à la maturité. Mais, je cite, dans Mercran, les protagonistes ne parcourent pas une évolution morale linéaire d'un pôle vers l'autre. Elles sont toutes à la fois, et ce, à des moments différents de leur vie. Dans toutes les phases de leur relation, il y a des manifestations d'égoïsme où le moi s'affirme contre autrui, ainsi que des moments d'une focalisation intensive et totale sur l'autre. Mais quelle stratégie d'écriture pour mettre en discours les liens affectifs entre les protagonistes? On constatera d'abord que la désignation littérale directe d'émotions reste marginale. Les émotions apparaissent à travers le regard, les mots, la conscience d'une jeune femme cultivée qui n'hésitera pas à nommer aussi des émotions négatives et à se servir parfois d'un lexique cru, technique ou volontairement désillusionnant. L'évocation indirecte de l'affectif passe ensuite par le corps, mais le roman nous parle aussi sur le plan des analogies métaphoriques qui invitent à aller au-delà des apparences. Or, de son titre jusqu'aux grandes dystopies de l'eau, de l'espace clos, etc., qui le recouvre d'un vernis réseautique, Mergrand fait ample usage des moyens stylistiques en question. Dans un dernier chapitre, je reviens enfin sur certaines autres facettes de l'éthique du Caire, de Nodding à Toronto, selon qui le Caire implique, je cite, tout ce que nous faisons en vue de maintenir, de continuer et de réparer notre monde. Ce monde inclut nos corps, nos individualités et notre environnement que nous cherchons à tisser ensemble dans un maillage complexe qui soutient la vie. Cette conception élargie du Caire se reflète aussi chez Trifiatis, qui, sur un mode extrêmement critique, met le lecteur face à l'arsenal complet d'instances de soins, qu'elles soient privées ou étatiques. La narratrice illustre amplement la prise en charge par l'État de l'individu dépendant qui traverse plusieurs stations. Je cite. La résidence pour personnes semi-autonomes, la résidence pour personnes non autonomes, l'hôpital de réadaptation, le retour à l'hôpital, elle ne pouvait pas se réadapter, le centre de soins de longue durée, puis le milieu de vie pour aînés. Les termes sont interchangeables comme les lieux eux-mêmes, tous régis par la volonté systémique de gérer la vie ou ce qui en reste selon les règles de justice et de compétences techniques. Et je termine sur ma conclusion. Cette brève incursion dans le monde des soins institutionnalisés fait ressortir que l'auteur et sa narratrice se font une autre idée du Caire et de la rencontre humaine. L'histoire de la relation entre grand-mère et petite-fille démontre que le Caire, la sollicitude perdent leur légitimité s'ils se situent exclusivement du côté de l'abstraction, du principe ou du système. Selon Gilligan et beaucoup d'autres, le Caire se développe dans le contexte du relationnel. Et ici, dans le roman, même dans celui de la réciprocité, puisqu'on ne peut pas penser la grand-mère sans penser la petite fille. À la différence de ce que préconisent les spécialistes en uniforme, il s'agit de rester vivant, pour reprendre les mots de Nicole Brossard. Et rester vivant peut impliquer beaucoup de choses, le jugement, le choix, la délibération et l'action. Je m'excuse, c'était une petite pause. Passons maintenant à notre prochain point. All the Fields comprises 5 sections, the last of which is entitled Writing Through Affect, and this section is a highlight in the book. As compared to the preceding chapters, it proposes alternative forms of writing affect through the voices of Smaro Camborelli, Nicole Brossard and Louise Dupré. Ce soir, Nicole et Louise nous font un grand cadeau. Elles ont accepté de participer à ce lancement. Dès le début de la collaboration entre le CLC et le SEC, Nicole et Louise nous ont fidèlement accompagnés. Lors des 2 congrès, elles ont lu et donné des conférences et elles ont publié des textes originaux dans les volumes qui en sont sortis. Je suis très heureuse de le revoir ce soir, même si notre rencontre reste virtuelle. Mais permettez-moi de présenter Louise Dupré. Louise Dupré est poète, romancière, dramaturge et essayiste. Elle a publié une vingtaine de titres qui lui ont mérité de nombreuses distinctions, donc 2 fois le prix de poésie du gouverneur général du Canada. Ces livres ont été traduits en 9 langues et je me considère particulièrement privilégiée parce que Louise m'a confié la traduction en allemand de Tout comme elle pour la voix du livre de Francfort. Le texte qu'elle nous propose dans tous les sens s'appelle Des fantômes dans les yeux. Et comme son écriture tout entière, il se distingue par la subtilité. La voix de Louise est une voix fragile, mais elle a des choses fortes à dire. Louise y développe une poétique de la fin des temps, accompagnée de réflexions sur sa propre position d'écrivaine. Aujourd'hui, suggère-t-elle, l'écriture ne résout plus les problèmes, ne permet plus de célébrer la beauté, l'harmonie, ni de divertir. Mais elle peut formuler la souffrance, elle peut faire obstacle à la stupeur, elle peut réactiver l'agentivité et redonner au sujet son humanité. L'écriture et le texte littéraire représentent alors un bastion contre le désastre et un laboratoire où penser le monde autrement. Louise, veux-tu nous lire un passage de ton texte?
Je voudrais d'abord remercier Ursula Moser de cette belle présentation, fort généreuse. I want to thank to Marie Carrière, Ursula Moser and Kip Dodson, who edited the book, and the University of Alberta Press. Je vais lire certains fragments du texte que j'ai publié dans le livre Des fantômes dans les yeux. Note 1. La littérature et l'art n'ont jamais empêché les guerres, les génocides, la dictature du capital, le racisme, les injustices, les tueries, la violence des hommes envers les femmes et les enfants, la cruauté envers les animaux, la destruction. Et pourtant, chaque matin, j'écris. J'écris parce que je suis de plus en plus horrifiée de ce que je vois au journal télévisé. Je ressens l'urgent besoin de me laisser dériver au gré de certains mots qui m'entraînent vers d'autres affects qu'un effroi paralysant, des mots qui ouvrent à l'indignation, à la colère et à l'engagement. J'écris pour que les mots me sortent de ma stupeur, qu'ils me redonnent une humanité, qui me permettent d'aimer, de bouger, d'agir. J'écris parce que l'écriture me permet de rester du côté de la vie. Note 2. Tu écris de plus en plus vulnérable devant le sort du monde. L'écriture te donne à voir, à entendre, à sentir ton cœur battre en toi, à rêver que tu n'es pas seul en ta solitude, que vous êtes nombreuses, nombreux, à penser que le monde est mené par des fous de toutes les idéologies, que tu n'es pas seul à douter de l'avenir, à avoir peur. Tu as honte d'appartenir à l'espèce qu'on dit humaine. Accepter sa propre vulnérabilité, lui faire une place en soi est le premier geste d'amour que l'on puisse se porter. C'est se considérer du nombre des gens qui souffrent, se montrent capables de regarder les autres, de leur tendre la main. On se rend alors compte que l'on fait partie d'une communauté, celle de l'humanité, qui appelle à l'aide. Note 8. Dans son essai « Soigner, aimer », la poète et psychiatre Vanessa Yunzi pose cette question. Soigner, écrire, serait faire l'amour, serait faire amour de la fragilité? Le CARE nous propose une vision à contre-courant de celle de la société actuelle, où la fragilité n'est plus un objet de honte, mais un état de fait à comprendre et à aimer. Cette vision correspond à celle de la poète que je suis. Car j'écris pour m'approcher toujours plus près de la blessure, pour lui donner une dignité en trouvant des mots aux émotions qui n'en ont pas, pour créer un espace à la douleur invisible, pour compatir et donner aux lecteurs et lectrices matière à compassion. Note 11. L'écriture actuelle n'a plus la prétention d'illuminer le monde, mais elle projette des ombres éclairantes autour de nous. Elle est notre conscience, elle dit notre refus du silence, notre refus de collaborer. L'écrivain ne peut plus se targuer d'être un prophète ni un mage, mais il veut néanmoins transmettre une mémoire, devenir un témoin subversif de son temps. Note 17. Dans l'écriture, tes émotions te font découvrir des figures qui te font penser autrement, t'amènent à faire des rapprochements inusités entre passé et présent, entre présent et avenir. Les émotions que tu essaies d'exprimer n'ont rien à voir avec ce que te propose la civilisation actuelle, qui carbure aux émotions fortes, aux sensations extrêmes, seul repère possible pour des individus dont la sensibilité est anesthésiée. Avez-vous une âme? Demande Julia Kristeva dans son essai Les nouvelles maladies de l'âme, et elle poursuit. Confrontée aux neuroleptiques, à l'aérobic et aux zappages médiatiques, l'âme existe-t-elle encore? Note 18. L'écriture ne peut plus être une recherche de beauté, ni d'harmonie, ni de plaisir, encore moins de divertissement. Elle tremble, elle voit noir, elle voit sale. Elle ne sauvera pas le monde, elle ne le changera pas non plus, et elle le sait. Mais elle peut du moins rendre aux individus un peu de la subjectivité qui leur a été enlevée. J'écris parce que je crois que l'écriture reste un laboratoire où il est possible de penser autrement la vie. Merci. Thank you very much.
Merci, Louise. I have the distinct pleasure of turning the conversation over to Nicole Brassard at this point. I'll do so much more briefly than I might otherwise have because I'm well aware that the time is getting on. Very briefly from Nicole's biographical notes in the book, I just sort of want to note them briefly and then sort of say my inadequacy in being able to introduce a writer like Nicole Brassard, qui est une poète, romancière et essayiste qui, depuis 1965, a publié une quarantaine de livres. It's her influence over the years has just been enormous, and her major literary awards as well. I want to just have a very short personal note to say that when I was an undergraduate student back at the very end of the last millennium, one of the books that we passed around amongst ourselves was Nicole Brassard's Mauve Desert. It was a book that sort of made the rounds in the English department at UVic, where I was doing my degree. And it was a book that I think for many of us studying in the program at the time was an opening to think about feminist writing, the writing coming from Quebec, and for many of us also just an opening to contemporary feminist writing in such a variety of registers. So having had that book passed to me when I was an undergraduate student was incredibly important for my own development, and now to be able to pass the microphone over to Nicole Brassard is a tremendous honor. So please, Nicole Brassard, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? Thank you very much. Ah, c'est un grand plaisir de vous retrouver, même virtuellement, mais c'est vraiment toujours un grand plaisir. Et un plaisir aussi de savoir qu'il y a 2 livres merveilleux, Cautionary Hopeful et le livre sur les affects et les émotions, qui est magnifique. J'ai fait un petit montage de quelques paragraphes de mon texte qui s'intitulait « Émotions vraies, sensations de fiction ». Alors que l'Homo sapiens essaie de s'inventer une amortalité, une ubiquité, une mémoire infaillible, une intelligence artificielle, nous continuons de verser les mêmes larmes autour de nos blessures et parlons encore de ce bien-être qui s'installe parfois dans la poitrine sous le nom de beauté. Nous tenons à l'émotion car elle est, avec la conscience, une certitude soudainement comblée, mais aussi un bris dans le sens qui exigera du renouveau. Pourquoi l'émotion est-elle aujourd'hui si valorisée et en demande? Est-elle à mettre en concurrence avec la raison, l'objectivité qui ont régné au masculin pendant des siècles de patriarcat? L'émotion omniprésente comme une valeur sociale garantit-elle une démocratisation des sentiments positifs et une vulgarisation de la philosophique sensibilité humaniste? Car nul doute qu'une émotion partagée publiquement réduit l'écart de classe, de genre, de race. Elle nivelle et rassemble, tout comme on dit que devant la mort, nous sommes égaux. Un magnat de la finance, un politicien qui pleure en conférence de presse, rétablit de facto une partie de son capital d'humanité. Y a-t-il des émotions cheap? Non, puisque chaque émotion est une mesure de chaleur et de vérité pour qui la vit. Alors que l'émotion a longtemps été confinée au rituel, à l'art et à la vie intime, pourquoi déborde-t-elle autour de nous, s'infiltre-t-elle dans la vie publique, économique, journalistique, éducative, philosophique, à ce point qu'elle peut réorienter en quelques heures de décision politique, qu'elle peut réorienter en quelques heures des décisions politiques qui semblaient pourtant réglées. L'émotion peut-elle faciliter ou parfaire la qualité des liens à l'autre, amour, amitié, compassion, sollicitude, alors que la technologie et l'individualisme qui en découlent nous isolent systématiquement les uns des autres? En d'autres termes, l'émotion publique vécue intimement suscite-t-elle des délicatesses envers l'autre, une compréhension, une amabilité que les lois protectrices et humanistes n'auraient pas réussi à instaurer? S'il est vrai que le nouveau roman, la modernité, le formalisme, le post-formalisme ont voulu refouler la subjectivité, le lyrisme, le moi, faire un mauvais parti au jeu afin de faire place à une esthétique du neutre en performance dans la langue, il faut en retour constater que les écritures au féminin ont presque immédiatement ouvert la porte au biographique, au jeu, à des territoires inédits de confession et d'affirmation susceptibles de créer des émotions et des affects renouvelant le corpus de la sexualité, de l'amour, de la violence, de la folie, de la création. Il y a toujours eu des écritures identitaires, mais je dirais que les femmes ont déployé un plus grand éventail de postures émotionnelles dans l'écriture. Il serait même plausible d'affirmer que l'écriture des femmes dans sa masse éditoriale aurait engendré, depuis les 50 dernières années, et cela d'une manière naturelle, entre guillemets, une nouvelle forme esthétique fondée sur le biographique, l'émotion s'y rattachant, allant presque de soi, puisque la reconstitution d'un sujet blessé est en soi une chose émouvante qui appartient à cet ordre du récit qui instruit par la vie. Alors que le virtuel nous chasse du réel, comment faire exister la réalité, sinon qu'en la suivant à la trace dans nos corps de première personne du singulier? Avons-nous désormais besoin de la vraie vie pour exister?
Thank you so very much, Nicole. And so you have returned us to la première personne singulier and Marie. And I'm really overwhelmed today. It has been such a rich hour of readings and reflections. And these two books are so important, I think, for how they point to the ways that writers make it possible to inhabit our worlds at various points of crisis and inhumanity and even just day-to-day difficulty, and help us not to succumb to despair, to give us hope cautiously, perhaps. But so thank you so much to all of you, Marie, Kit, Ursula, Louise, Nicole. It's been such a pleasure